How we doing, everybody? Gonna give it a couple minutes here, let a few more people jump on, but for those that were in the waiting room, wanted to make sure you guys knew we were rolling.
Hi, Jim. Muted.
There you go. Go ahead. Cool. So my name's Jim Lampros. If you're new to the Trout Club or not yet a member, I've been a board member for, I think, going on 6 years now. And Jerry asked me to help out for our meeting this month, our program, I should say. It's getting to be that time of year. I think we've got a little chill. We got a little rain last night, and the chatter is starting to turn to steelhead. So what I thought I would do is give you guys just a couple of, I'll say, favorite fall swinging patterns, streamers for steelhead that have been good to me over the years, and kind of tell you a little bit about my philosophy. Not going to show you anything earth-shattering today. These are very basic materials and techniques and flies that should be, if you're, a moderate to intermediate fly tire, should be easy to turn out, and flies that you can fish without being afraid to lose, because you can replace them. So hopefully, depending on how time allows, we'll go through a couple patterns, both pretty similar in nature and materials use. So if at any time you have questions, I've got Bob Barnes here with me running the ones and twos. So Bob's going to be monitoring the chat for any questions, and we'll have a little time at the end, hopefully, to speak to those and any other questions that you guys may have about fall steelhead or the fishery or the flies, etc. So to start out, what am I tying with? I've got a lousy, crappy, old 15-year vise. I couldn't tell you the brand because I've had it that long that the brand is worn off, but yes, I'm on their pro staff. And I'm going to be tying on tubes today. So if you've never tied on tubes and you have questions, I'll save that to the end about tying on tubes, why tubes versus shanks or regular hooks, how to rig them. I can answer some of those questions at the end, but I am tying on tubes today. So I've got a HMH tube here that I'm tying with, just because it's what I had. I was telling Bob earlier, in a pinch, I've tied 2 flies on drink stir straws in the past and caught fish on them too. So I don't worry too much about the tube itself. So I've already started my thread here at the back of the fly. And the first thing I'm going to do is tie in some thin copper wire, which is going to be the ribbing for the body of my fly. So I've tied that in and secured it. I will say, although the camera may not be able to zoom in, I've left a little gap between my thread base and the back of the tube, and that's going to be the space that I'm going to put my junction tubing on when I'm ready to fish this fly. And that's secured.
Jim, may I ask you, what's the mandrel you have inside that tube?
So that's a little pop-in accessory that goes right in the jaws of the vise.
I see that, but there's a mandrel inside that holds it, makes it stiff. You know what I mean?
We're actually using a sewing needle today.
Oh, that's keeping my tube rigid?
Yes.
Is that what you're asking about, Tom? Got it.
Yeah.
So normally this accessory comes with some pins of different diameters to match the diameter of the plastic tubing. I moved this summer and lost mine, so we're actually just using a sewing needle, little push pin, to provide a little, rigid base for that tube, so it doesn't flex too much when I'm putting pressure on or tension on the thread. I'm full of hacks. I'm always just kind of piecing it together on the fly. So hopefully you learn something here you can use in a pinch. So for the body of this fly, we're going to keep it super slim and clean. So what I've got here is just some copper crystal flash. And I've clipped about 4 inches of, I don't know, maybe a dozen or so strands. And I'm going to tie that in at the back of the hook, right where I tied my wire in. And I'm not going to worry about getting all those loose ends down or clipping them because I'm going to wrap over them. So I've got my wire tied in. I've got the crystal flash was going to be the body of my fly. And I'm going to advance that thread forward towards what would be the eye on a shanked hook. And on these plastic tubes, I want to put a pretty good thread base on there, similar to how you would on a hook shank, but maybe even more so on the tubing because it's larger in diameter. And that thread base is going to keep my materials from sliding on the hook as I fish it and hopefully catch fish with it.
Hey Jim, do you have a like preference for thread and thread diameter?
Yeah, good question. I always like to use the heaviest thread that I think I can get away with for the fly that I'm tying, just because it doesn't break off as much. And I will say this is like a floss. I think it's the Orvis saltwater thread. And it's got a little wax to it. It's got a little slip, so it doesn't bite into these tubes as well as some other threads. But that's why I lay that extra thread base on there so that I don't get that material slipping on the body of the tube. So I've advanced my thread. I've still got my wire hanging back here. I've got my copper flash, and this is going to be my body. If you have copper diamond braid, that would work too. The body, I don't worry about too much. Like I said, slim, clean. The goal of these flies that I'm tying tonight for me is simple and quick. And again, I don't worry about the underbody too much. So I've wrapped maybe 1.5 inches of an underbody. I'm going to tie that off with my thread. Clip it. So that's going to be the underbody of my fly. A couple more wraps to secure the loose material. Then I've got that thin copper wire. I don't have my spool here, but I don't worry too much about the gauge of the wire. Just something thin to keep that underbody from unraveling as hopefully fish eat it or it's banging around in the rocks.
Are you counter wrapping, Jim, or are you just wrapping?
I don't.
Yeah,
I just find it easier to go one way, but
sure.
Counter wrapping will work too. Okay. Clip my wire. All right, so I've got a little bit of an underbody to that fly. I don't have one with me, but if you want to see what I'm tying, there was a post on the Trout Club Instagram page that showed a couple of the bugs in the general platform or profile that I'm trying to recreate here tonight. So I've got my underbody. Now what I want to create is a little flash. So kind of a flashy underbody that's going to create some translucence, some profile. And the other thing I want this next step or this next set of materials to do is kind of create a prop or a shoulder for the wing of the fly. So what I'm going to do, I have here, let's see, I've already cut some. This is it's kind of a cool material I picked up a few years ago. It's a flex hackle from Orvis. And it's a strung material. And it has silicone silly legs in there, along with some mirror flash. It's an interesting material. It's easy to overdo it with this material, I found. It's one of those that a little bit goes a long way, but it creates a nice prop because of the rigidity of the flash and those legs. I think it creates some movement in the fly, and it also kind of pushes water out, which helps the swimming materials like rabbit tail or marabou to kind of swim and undulate a little better. So for this step too, I've also used just a regular dubbing brush, like those EP brushes are great. They don't move as much, but they do create a good shoulder. And I'll use occasionally a dubbing loop for this or Hackle flash. Hackle flash is great. And on the next fly I do, if we have time, I'll use some of that too. So when I tie this in, I want the fibers of those rubber legs and flash laying back along the body of the hook, or in this case, the tube. I don't want them sticking forward. So I'm going to lock that in advance the thread forward. And then for what I'm trying to accomplish with this part of the fly, no more than 2 turns of this material. And again, I'm trying to make sure that the material doesn't twist on me and flip those rubber legs forward. I want them laying back along the body of the fly. And you can see those rubber legs kind of start to stand up. And I'll lock it off. Clean that up. Okay, so you can kind of see I've created that. What on this fly is going to be that little bit of shoulder, a little bit of flash underneath, a little bit of movement. That's what I'm trying to accomplish. So before I tie in the next material, I'm actually at this point, I like to tie in, if I'm using eyes on the fly, whether they be dumbbell eyes or B-chain eyes, which I'm going to use in this case. I like to tie these in now, and that kind of helps me gauge the difference between what will be the back of my fly or the body of my fly and then the head. And so I can kind of gauge how much material to use, make sure I don't run out of room to finish the fly. Because if you've ever spent 20 or 30 or 40 minutes tying a fly and run out of room at the end and had a crowded head or had to start over, it's super frustrating. So this fly, I do like to use some eyes, a couple reasons. Again, I'm tying on a tube. It's a plastic tube. It's a thin diameter. There's not a lot of weight to it. So this fly by itself is going to have a hard time getting down. And also, depending on how the materials are tied in and what materials you're using, it can be difficult to get a tube fly to keel correctly, which means to orient right in the water. So just a little bit of weight. In this case, I'm going to use just 1 set of bead chain eyes. Often helps with that keel. It helps get the fly started on that sink. Again, we're using these, I'm swinging these flies on a sink tip, so I don't rely on the fly itself to get down to depth. I'm usually relying on my sink tip for that, but a little bit of weight does help get it started. I'll kind of interject here and say when it comes to how to weight flies, I would say all things being equal, which is the way I answer a lot of these questions, I prefer an unweighted fly, and I prefer to rely on the sink tip that I'm using and the way that I cast, the way that I manage the line, mend to control the depth. And the reason is pretty simple, that an unweighted fly, I think, swims better in current. When you're swinging flies, trying to get that presentation where you've got an actively swimming fly, I just think you get a little bit more movement out of an unweighted fly. So I tend not to use heavy dumbbell eyes, with some exceptions. If I'm fishing a really heavy current, fast chop, maybe I think the fish are sitting on the far side of the river and I need that fly to get down quickly so it doesn't fish over their head. That's a situation where I might use a heavy dumbbell eye fly. But generally speaking, especially for fall, and again, these are some flies I've chosen to show tonight because they're favorites for the fall. A lot of times we're fishing low and clear water, so getting that fly down isn't the issue. So I like unweighted or just a little bit of weight. In this case, just a couple of bead chain eyes. So again, I'm going to advance my thread a little bit, building that thread base as I go. And then I'm going to figure eight, and this might be hard for you to see, but I'm going to figure eight those bead chain eyes onto the bottom of the hook.
So Jim, while you're doing this, maybe you can talk a little bit, because you were kind of saying you put the bead chain eyes in, you put the eyes on now to kind of determine the rest of the size of the fly and everything. So how did you decide where to put those eyes on, right? What was your
it's a good question.
proportion? Yeah.
When I'm tying this fly, I'm thinking about probably a lower clear water scenario, which to me means I'm going to probably size down. So I'm not going to be fishing, if I'm swinging flies especially, I'm not going to be fishing a super big fly. I'm probably looking for something in that 2.5 to 3 inch range, which I would estimate at that. So I'm picturing that in my head. I've laid the base of my fly. I know I'm going to have a wing. which we're going to get to in a minute, that's going to be really the length and the body of my fly. So again, in my head, I'm picturing a 2.5, 3-inch fly, and thinking about how much of that needs to be made up of what I would visualize as the head. So in this case, I've probably laid or left about an inch gap between where my underbody, that hackle, and my, the front of my head is going to ultimately be.
Okay.
So.
And that 2.5, 3-inch range, that's sort of the go-to for around here, you think?
To me, that's a good place to start. It's a good place to start really anytime, but especially in the fall, low clear water, even into the early winter, we're often still dealing with low clear water. So I like that slightly smaller fly. And I've been playing around with flies even smaller than that. There's a lot of people fishing. One thing I think a lot about is fishing pressure, and trying to show them a fly that they're not seeing on the pass before me. So if somebody's fished the run before me, I'd like to show that fish something different. So even smaller flies, because it's very easy and exciting to fish a big 4.5-inch fly. It's not that they don't work, but but I think they can scare fish sometimes, especially if they're seeing a lot of them. So going smaller sometimes is not a bad idea, and I've been doing that a little bit more in recent years. So the next thing I'm going to do here is I talked about the wing, which in this case is going to be a bunny strip along the fly. I like to get a little bit more of that shoulder, that prop in there first before I tie the wing in. What that does is it's going to keep the wing kind of up and away from the materials, and it's going to help it move a little bit more in the back. Really trying to get as much movement as I can from the materials. So before I tie the wing in, I'm going to take a piece of, in this case, olive schlappen, and I'm going to tie that in right where I finished tying off my hackle, that flash hackle. And I'm just going to do a couple spins of this, palmering it, so pulling all the fibers back along the body as I wrap it. 2 or 3 turns of that, depending on the feather that you're using and how long those barbs are. And because I'm using a push pin instead of a direct pin, I'm getting a little twist on there.
Hey Jim, it's a little hard to see on the video here. Did you go all the way to the point where you've even got some of the marabou barbs?
I did.
Yeah.
Those marabou, those bottom butt sections of that feather swim nice and create a little more bulk, which is what I'm trying to do here. Now I'm gonna, I guess, start my wing. So I like a little bit of flash. I'm not gonna go crazy with flash on this fly or either of these flies. It's just mottled copper Flashabou. And I'm just going to grab maybe a half dozen strands. I'm going to cut them long. You can always trim the material later. You can't add more material once you're done. And I'm going to tie this in right where I left off. So I'll sandwich tie it in. I'm going to grab that forward facing material and pull it back. Tie that off. I like to do, anytime I'm tying in Flashabou on a fly, I like to do that, tie forward, fold it back, reverse tie it, whatever you call it. But that fold back and then tying over the base, you can kind of see it here, props that flash up and it makes it swim better. When you tie in with Flashabou, if it's all clumped in together, it almost like grabs itself. It doesn't swim as well. So that little reverse tie helps prop some of that flash up, and it really helps the flash move, which I think is a difference maker. I'm going to clean that thread up. And again, at this point now, I'm nearing the end. So I've got to be careful of how much space I have left between the back of the fly and ultimately where my head is going to be. So at this point, I'm going to tie in my wing. I really like on this style of fly that I'm doing, the barred bunny. You'll see on the next fly, again, depending on how our time goes, a lot of different materials can work for a wing. Arctic fox, bunny, marabou, you can kind of use any of those swimming materials, but I do like the barred materials because I think they add the illusion of more movement. I think the modeling in this case, I'm kind of going for like a Gobi sculpin type look, and I think that modeling mimics that well, and again, it adds to the illusion of movement even when the fly's holding stationary in the water. So I've cut maybe a 4-inch strip of barred olive, and as I said with the wing, I'm going to tie it in long because I can always trim it later. So I'm going to find a tie-in point, get my fingers wet, and kind of separate that bunny hair. So I have a nice clean tie-in point. And I'm going to seat that rabbit strip right on top of the hook with that tie-in point at the very front of where I tied off my Flashabou wing. Now you notice I'm going kind of slow here. Getting this type of fly right with a bunny strip wing has a lot to do with seating that leather of that rabbit strip perfectly, especially on a tube, because a tube is a little wider diameter. So it's easy to tie that leather strip in and have it slip one way or another or pinch, and that rotates the collar or the top spine of the bunny. And all of a sudden that fly isn't keeling right. It's swimming on its side. The rabbit strip isn't moving the way you'd want it to. So trying to get that rabbit strip seated perfectly on top of, in this case, the tube, or if you're tying on a shank, same thing. So I take my time and I kind of use I'm right-handed, so I use my left hand to work that leather, that bunny strip, so it's nice and flat and evenly seated on the top of the hook. And then I'm going to cut it, leaving as little bit of leather as I can. I don't want to leave much because that's just going to bulk up the head of my fly. And for this fly, I want a nice clean thread head. All right, it's a good place to pause because I've killed a spool of thread. So teachable moment. If we have any newer fly tires, if you run out of thread or if you break thread, you don't have to abandon the fly. In this case, I'm running out of thread. So what I'm going to do is tie it off with a few half hitches. Barely made it there, pal.
I was watching it unravel on you. I was wondering if you were going to get this done.
Throw a new spool on there, and then I'll just restart my thread as if I was starting to fly from scratch, right over that loose end where I cut off. Dab of super glue never hurts either. I don't know if there's any questions in the chat, if I can kill time.
No, nothing in the chat. Anybody have any questions so far for Jim?
How many people are sleeping?
Everybody seems awake.
I don't buy it. Here we go. So I'm just starting my thread right where I tied it off.
And there it is.
That's why I like the heavier thread.
Yep.
Let's try it again. You got to be careful too with bead chain. When you cut it with the cutters, occasionally you get rough edges on there and it can cut thread pretty easily. So I'm going to grab another olive schlappen feather. And this time you see I'm creating my tie-in point because I'm further forward on the head. I want the materials to be longer. So I'm creating bulk or body towards the front of the fly. So I'm going to create my tie-in point a little further down towards the base of the feather.
Do you have any criteria for these feathers when you look at them? Are you looking for anything when you're picking it off out of the pack?
I do. I'm looking for the length of the barbs, or the vertical part sticking off the stem there. Depending on how much bulk I'm trying to create, I want a feather that has fairly even consistency. So those barbs are mostly the same length from base to tip of the stem. And generally, if you pick up a pack of Schlappen, you'll kind of see there's some ratty feathers in there where some of the barbs are kind of binding together or twisting. I try not to use those unless I have to. And you also don't want, if you're going to be wrapping the feather instead of tying it in as a tail, you don't want too thick of a stem. As you get down towards this base of the feather, that stem gets a lot stiffer. It doesn't wrap as well. It creates a lot of bulk. So, those are things I'm looking at. And again, I'm going to palmer this and just do 2 or 3 turns and try to gauge, how much of a head I'm creating. And I'm using this left hand to pick those barbs out as I turn it. Anything that's sticking forward, I'm going to grab with my offhand, pull back and tie over. I want to keep that front pretty clean. So you can see I'm almost done. I'm right behind the eye. I've got just a little bit more room there, which is perfect. That's what I was trying to do. On this kind of sculpin and goby type low clear water fly, again, I said I like the modeling, and I like a little contrast. So not having it be all one color. Not that I haven't caught fish on just a solid straight olive fly. But I like those different tones. I think maybe that helps the fly show up in different light, different water clarity conditions, stuff like that. So what I've been finishing this version of this fly with is I've got a pheasant back from a hunt a couple years ago that I've picked a bunch of feathers off. And if you go through a full pheasant skin, you'll find there's a bunch of kind of marabou type feathers that work really nice, just like Schlappen. They've got a little modeling to them. They've got some dark gray, some dark brown, some kind of ginger, and it creates a nice little contrast with that olive. So I selected a pretty wispy kind of marabou type feather from that pheasant skin. And you got to be careful with these because the stems are super thin, so it's very easy to break them. But I'm going to create that tie-in point. This one, the stem is light enough that I can just take that tip and fold it back. And then again, I'm just going to do a couple of palmered wraps of this. And I've tried to pick feathers such that this pheasant marabou, if you will, is longer than the Schlappen was right where I cut it off. Tie it off.
Yeah.
Until I'm used to hacking this together. I'm pulling those fibers back as I go so that nothing's sticking forward. I want it all laying back along the fly. One of the reasons I picked this color for this version of this fly to do tonight, in the fall, especially as we get into late October and those leaves start coming down, you'll notice our rivers have a very distinct tea stain, or that tannin color from the leaves. And it's very easy for flies to get lost in that, against that tea stain watercolor and all those leaves tumbling downstream. And it seems to me over the years that copper, copper flash, so that's why I like that copper wing and that copper underbody, just stands out really well against that tea stained water. I think pink does too, but I have more confidence personally in copper and natural tones in the fall. But that copper, you'll notice if you drop a copper fly in with a bunch of copper flashabou in the fall, it really just, there's something about, especially if you get a sunny day, that fly just glows. And again, you notice I didn't overdo it, but my accents are all copper on this fly, and I think that helps the fly show up. So to finish the fly, now depending on how you managed your shank space, in this case the tube, or what you want this fly to do, or what you're going to do it for, you can add a head. So whether that's creating a dubbing loop, and do some copper ice dubbing or olive ice dubbing, create a little head, a little bulkhead in front. I like Australian possum a lot. Exact same fly, just with a possum head. Look very sculpiny, very gopany, pushes water well. I kind of, again, I try to keep it simple. I want to be able to replicate this quickly. I like just a nice clean thread head. And I'll hit it with some super glue and call it a day. And we'll try to give you guys a close-up. But if anybody has any questions or wasn't able to see anything, now would be a good time.
Jim, I do think we have time for another one if you've got another fly you'd like to tie today too.
Yeah, the other fly, same idea, little different materials combo. So I think my two confidence colors, which is why I picked these, Jerry asked me for a couple favorites, in the fall, and for that matter, probably 6 days out of 7 are white and olive, or olive and copper. I don't think there's anywhere you could go really in the world where there's fish that eat other fish and should have any reservations about fishing white. It's just a very bait fishy color. Our steelhead out in the lake, we know they eat a lot of shiners, they eat smelt. We've had, especially I've noticed in recent years, in the lower ends of the rivers and in the harbors, we've had a lot of those little snack sized shad. And in at least a few incidents, I know of people catching steelhead in those, those harbor areas or those staging areas of the lake where those fish are gorged on shad. So anything white, and then like I said, olive and copper, especially as we get into late fall, early winter, I really like that olive and copper that I spun here. Again, not knowing what people's experience levels are coming to this on a tube. Now, in theory, I could leave the front of that tube just like it is, but what I'll typically do is cut that with about 1/4 inch of gap between the eye, or where I finish the fly, and the front of the tube. And then I'll take a lighter and just very briefly hit that tube with it inverted. So I'll have the tube vertical, hit it with a lighter, and then I'll kind of mushroom back that plastic on the tube and create a little lip, so that if your materials would happen to come loose or the thread was sliding on the tube, it's not going to slide off the front of the tube. So that's what I'll do when I get home with this, is I'll hit that front end with a lighter. Now, same thing I mentioned, leaving the rabbit strip long. I may decide later that I want to shorten this up, and I can do that. And then lastly, I mentioned this earlier, but you can see I left a little bit of a gap there between the back of the body, and that's where my junction tubing is going to slide over the tube, and then I will seat the eye of the hook in that junction tubing. So.
Jim, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
What is your thinking on tying that similar fly as an intruder?
Yeah, that fly is almost kind of like I don't know, it's the most basic streamer there is. So lest anybody should accuse me of saying that I invented the woolly bugger. I mean, it's basically like a single station intruder. So it doesn't have that back, but I mean, in theory, you could do what I just did and tie another station in the back with a bunny strip or any kind of tail that you wanted coming off the back, and just have a little bigger profile with more material. So
do you reckon it does better than the kind of one stage version as you just tied?
No, I fish, I guess to your question, I fish a lot of intruders. You can tie a small intruder that is basically the same size and similar profile. I think where they really come in handy is if you're fishing higher dirty water and you want a big fly with a big silhouette. The whole idea behind the intruder was that you get that big silhouette without a lot of material, which makes it easier to cast. So hopefully that answers the question. I'm cutting a tube here. I pulled a tube. I think there are 4 or 5 inch tubes. And again, I'm going to cut it to probably 3 inches. And then seat it on my pin in my adapter. I wish I had the right pin. We made that one work. So again, I told you at the beginning, my caveat was nothing earth-shattering here. These are simple flies, same template, winged fly that's going to have a lot of movement, a lot of swim, not a lot of material, and very easy to cast. One thing I noticed, I've probably been guiding and teaching anglers two-handed casting and swinging flies on sink tips for maybe actually 10 years now. And it's amazing the difference if you're relatively new and learning and starting to get comfortable with two-handed casting and casting sink tips. The fly itself, how large and how much water it holds and how heavy it is makes a very big difference in your cast. So it's actually something I might point out is if you fall into that category where you just picked up two-handed casting or you're just getting into swinging flies, even if it's on a single hand rod, start with a lighter fly. That's another reason to learn to tie on tubes or to buy and fish tubes. They're that much lighter and they cast so much easier. Like I'll have anglers getting very frustrated with their casting. Say the cast won't turn over. They can't get it to go where it wants. I'll say, bring it in, cut the fly they have off, which might have dumbbell eyes on it. And I'll put an unweighted tube on there and there it goes. 60 feet to the other bank. So if you're struggling with your casting, put a lighter fly on because you'll cast better, you'll be happier, you'll be more confident, you'll fish it better, you'll probably catch a fish. So that's something to think about. So for this one, this is going to be my white that I was talking about. I said I love fishing white anytime, 8 days a week, but especially in the fall. I could think back to probably most of the last 10 years, first day of getting out there swinging flies. And I think maybe 10 out of 10, I started with something white. So interestingly enough, I like to tie the white, or really a bunch of my flies, with a super bright contrasting thread. I don't know if it makes a difference, but it hasn't hurt anything. So I've got like a bright orange, neon orange thread that I'm going to start with this one. And especially on this one, again, I don't know that it makes any difference. But on this one, what I've taken accustomed to doing is putting a little bright orange thread tag on the back, maybe a 1/4 inch at most, 1/8 of an inch. Green butt skunk idea.
Say an homage to the salmon fly.
Yeah. I don't know if it makes a difference, but I think it looks cool. It has a little contrast.
Yeah, for sure.
And for the body on this one, Same thing, I'm gonna tie in some copper wire. If I can find it. I mentioned it before, but diamond braid is great for these little super clean, slim underbodies that have a little bit of flash. But I forgot my diamond braid. So in a pinch, crystal flash works great. So I tied the wire in. Again, you're gonna see, I don't know if you can see it in the light, but I'm gonna leave that little bit of red thread hanging off the back of the body of the fly is kind of that hot butt. I'm gonna grab, I don't know, dozen strands of crystal flash, cut it long, because I'm gonna wrap this as my body. Tying it in where I tied in the copper braid, copper wire, sorry. And then I'm going to advance my thread. And again, depends on how big a fly you want to tie. I'm going small-ish with these, 2.5 inches or so long. So I've advanced my thread. I'm going to wrap that crystal flash as a body. I don't, I'd be curious if anyone disagrees, but on a lot of these swinging flies, you'll see people doing, I guess what I would call fancy. To me, a fancy underbody is anything that has more than 2 materials. That's kind of fancy. I don't know that it makes a difference. So you'll see some people, like on the intruder, some people will hackle the underbody. I don't know that the fish ever sees that. I don't know that it makes the fly swim any different. It may.
Well, so there is a bit of a historic context for it, right? Within the salmon fly world, a lot of the, let's say, spay style salmon flies did have a 2/3 to even full body under hackle, but that was to kind of give some life to a dubbed underbody, right? So, and give some structure.
I can see that. And again, it kind of depends on what you're doing, with what this one here, you're kind of covering that up with the shoulder or whatever you want to call the front collar. But a lot of those traditional flies don't have that big webby collar.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to take my wire and wrap over that, especially if you, like I said, I like diamond braid better. It's just quicker. It's less fuss than the crystal flash. They both work fine. But you do get a little bit of underbody showing through, so you can play with the combination of what flash you wrapped for the underbody and the thread base that you laid down to create kind of like a two-tone look. And this kind of like pearl over red, I don't know. It's always worked for me. I don't know. Like I said, I don't know how much they even see it, but it's worked for me. So we stick with it. Okay. So same thing we did with the other fly. We laid that underbody. And now we're going to do a shoulder. So I'm going to do one, instead of using that flex wrap, which I like, this stuff here, and I have it in white too. And I've had good luck mixing that into flies, but I'm going to use UV Polar Chenille. This one is UV Silver. It kind of has that iridescent purple mixed in with the silver, which kind of has a shaddy feel to it, and I like it. So I tie that in. I'm starting with my thread. I'm actually creating a little bulk, which is going to prop that material up just a little bit, because again, I'm trying to create that shoulder, whatever they call it, shoulder wing for the prop for the wing. And this stuff's a little sparser than that flex wrap, so I'm going to do more turns to try to build that underbody up. Each time I'm kind of collaring it back with my left hand. Pin is giving out on me. Cut it flush. You see it's starting to stick forward, so I'll pull that back and do a couple wraps up against the base. Okay. Now I'm going to tie my, remember, like I said before, I like to tie the eyes in at this point. So I'm going with silver bead chain for the white color scheme. I like to tie these in now so that I know kind of how to manage my space for the front of my fly or the head. Again, I probably, for this size of fly, I probably gave it about a 1/4 inch drop to my bead chain. And I'm tying it on the underside of the hook. Again, I want that combination of the wing, the movement, and the current pulling against the wing, and then the weight of the eyes to keel that fly. And then I'm going to work the thread back to where I tied my hackle off. Okay, same thing as I said before. I like, before I tie my wing in, on this one I'm going to use Arctic Fox, white Arctic Fox for a wing. But before I tie that wing in, I like to tie one more collar of something. In this case, it's going to be schlappen, to prop that wing up, which helps it. You'll notice the difference when you see the fly in the water in current. It really helps that wing swim and kick. So this is white Arctic Fox. You'll kind of see, if you've ever worked with this stuff before, there's some guard hairs, which are those longer, coarser hairs. And those really help create profile and taper to that wing, so it has that fish body silhouette. So you want to make sure when you're selecting a clump off a tuft of fox or raccoon or whatever it may be, that you get some of those guard hairs in there, because it helps create some of that taper. So this one's been worked over pretty good. Oh, I got some good stuff right here. Now, the other thing about working with fox or fin raccoon, that the base of the hair down by the leather tuft is very dense, and it gets kind of natty and stuff. So you'll see me kind of working that material back, because I don't want all that like real fine, dense underbody hair. At least I don't want too much of it. I want to kind of work that out of there and get a nice, or as clean of a cut as I can down there near the base. And a little bit of this, same thing, a little bit goes a long way. I would say if you're tying a fly like this with a fox or raccoon wing for the first time, start with just a little bit. You can always tie a little bit more, but tie it onto the hook, clump tie it in like I'll show you. Work that material out, pull out any loose hairs, and then see if you need more. Otherwise, you can get a really bulky wing that doesn't swim quite as well. You see, I'm working all that dense under hair out, which makes a big difference.
Jim, did you mean to put a piece of schlopping in there first?
Yeah, I did,
Okay.
but that's okay. Same thing like I said about tying the wing in on the bunny strip. You want to make sure that this wing gets top tied, that it doesn't slide around to either side of the hook. And then for this one, I'm going to throw a flash wing on top of that. So I like that white silver combination, or a little bit of blue, a little bit of purple. This stuff, I have to kind of work it out of here because this is a blended material, but this scale flash, I really like. Same thing, a little bit goes a long way. It just glows in the water, and you can kind of get it in different shades. This one has, I forget what they call this, it's like steelhead blue. But for these flies that I'm tying here, I don't need much. I'll take one long strand, and then get 3 or 4 shorter strands out of that. And it's amazing how much this stuff shows up in the water with very little material. Tie that off, cut it. Do the same thing on the other side. Okay. All right. So you see I'm getting a lot of bulk in terms of thread and material here behind the eyes. So that means I'm going to have to use less when I go to palmer that schlappen for the collar or the head. I'm going to have to use a little less material or it's going to get really out of hand. So.
But that's just a product of how kind of bulky the fox, the Arctic fox is, right?
In this case, yeah. I also did a few extra thread wraps trying to build that base up behind the eyes. And two, I want to check myself. The orientation, again, whether it's a hook shank or a tube, it doesn't matter. But getting that wing dead center, middle of the eyes is going to help with keel. I know over the years I've been frustrated a few times because I tied, what I thought was an awesome fly. And then I swim it and it's swimming sideways. And little things like, how the wing is set onto the top of the hook, or the way the eyes are positioned on the underside of the hook, can make a big difference. So piece of white schlappen, that's going to be my collar. And on this particular feather, which has much longer, webbier barbs, I'm going to start further up towards the tip. I'm going to make sure that my flash doesn't get wrapped in the feather. I want to make sure that's pulled back along the body. And then I'm going to palmer this. So pulling all the barbs back. Taking my time as I wrap it to let those barbs kind of stand up, straighten out.
Hey, Jim, we've got a question that just came in. Someone is asking for you to tell us about the Stain Master spinner.
Is it a Lampros asking that question?
It sure is.
You have to come to the next campfire session to hear that one. All right. And again, I'm trying to create taper here, a streamlined or kind of bullet taper to this fly so that it's bigger at the front. And that's not just for silhouette, but what that also does is if you build up the right amount of bulk on these, I'll call them wing styled streamers, that bulk kind of creates I'm sure there's a name for it, hydrology or something, but that bulk pushes water, and as that water slides over the collar or the bulk or the head, whatever the fly design happens to be, it makes that wing undulate quite a bit more. So that's why I want that, little bit of bulk in the front of the fly for profile and movement of that wing. All right, so I very easily could just kill the fly there, finish it off, and call it done. I do like when I'm fishing white or tying white flies, I like to throw a little bit of modeling in there. So just like a hint of contrasting colors. So a mallard flank or wood duck feather is kind of perfect for that. And you sometimes have to go through a lot of them to get the right one in terms of the length of the barbs coming off those feathers. On those wood duck and mallard feathers, a lot of times the stems are very thick. They're hard to wrap as a collar. So you want those. I like generally the ones that have the finer stems. They're easier to wrap and easier to get those barbs to lay down as a collar.
So you pulled half off there.
I stripped the stem on this one, and I want the barbs or the feathers laying back along the hook. So I stripped, if I'm looking at the feather, what's this, convex, right? Curve side down, I want the barbs on the right side because I'm tying, I'm going to wrap it away from me. Convex and concave. Always get me.
Yeah, a material like this can really get overdone if you don't strip it on one side. But
yes,
it adds a lot, and 2 turns, and all of a sudden you're taking over.
And a lot of the duck feathers, they get messy quick. It's hard to get the barbs to lay the right direction, and it looks sloppy, and I think it affects the way the fly fishes.
Yeah,
if you don't get it just right. And you also, with wood duck or mallard, you really have to separate those barbs as you wrap it. So I'm using my thumb here to kind of separate those barbs. Otherwise, they tend to clump up, and you'll end up with all your hackle on one side of the hook. So I'm going to wrap this to just behind the eye. Tie it off. And that one kind of did what I was talking about. It started flaring out on me, but not too bad. And then I'm going to finish this just with that bright red thread. Again, I don't know if it makes a difference. Sometimes I'll just do it with white. A lot of times I'll do it with gray, but adds just a little touch of pop contrast. And on the tubes.
Sorry, Jim.
I'm good.
I'm just trying to get a better. No good way to light a white fly.
I'll hold it up to the camera.
Yeah.
On the tubes, because that again, that diameter is a little bigger than, say, a typical hook shank. A lot of times a half hitch, especially if you're using thicker diameter thread like I am here. I said I like that saltwater thread. Half hitches will just undo themselves and slide off. So usually when I'm tying a tube, I'll just hit it with super glue. I'll let that thread hang or throw a set of Hackle pliers on there and hit it with super glue, let it dry. And that's
So have you actually tied a knot at the end, or you're just letting it hang right now?
I haven't. I'm just going to lay a base of super glue.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I noticed that on the first fly, and I wasn't sure if that was just for the sake of time here, or if that was actually.
No, it's usually what I do. I mean, if you're using the actual super glue, not head cement, I wouldn't do this with head cement. It's not strong enough. But you hit these with super glue and they never come undone. So you see what I did there? This one probably could have had, if I had a better clump of fox and I was tying it again, I probably would have had that clump of fox come out to about here with the guard hairs coming out a little further, but fly's going to swim good. It's sparse. It's got some movement. There's some flash in that underbody. Another thing, and I don't think I mentioned this before, it's a minor thing, but trimming your flash to the right length. Couple things on any kind of swinging streamer, and at least in my experience, whether it has a wing or not, if you have flash going along the back, don't cut that, especially if it's flashaboo, don't cut it flush. So don't cut it all straight, all the same length. That really inhibits the movement. So when you're cutting a flashaboo wing, or any kind of flash wing, cut it at an angle, cut it in little bits so that you have uneven lengths and you get that natural movement to the material. I think it makes a pretty big difference in the way the fish or the fly fishes and swims. So with that, the book comes out.
Yeah, get your flow, right?
You guys got to see this fly Jimmy came up with.
Jim, just before we finish, can you hold both of the flies up next to each other? Because I think they've got really different profiles to them. It's probably worth just kind of thinking about.
Yeah. So here, let me clean that tube up a little bit.
And while Jim gets these ready, I'm just going to say something about the Trout Club as well, right? So this is the first of our 2021-22 season, of programming. Next month, we've got another Trout Club member, Steve Madewell, doing a presentation for us on, I think it's 40 years fishing Steelhead Alley, something like that. So a lot of knowledge coming next month. And then also at the end of next month, we are returning to the annual Steelheaders Ball. So big party, October 29th. Lots of marketing going out in the coming weeks about that. Tickets are available now, but website's too long to say over the air. But look for updates on that in the coming weeks. Steve has put together a tremendous band for us, Steve Madewell. Lots of raffles, 50/50s. So there's cash to be made if you bring your cash to gamble. We'll do a cash bar, and we've got a food truck serving really good burgers available that evening. So looking forward to it again, October 29th, Friday night, right before Halloween. Mark your calendars.
Sweet.
Anything to close us out with here, Jim?
No? Any questions?
First off, I'd just like to say thank you, Jim. Also, is there any way that we could have these flies posted on your Instagram or the Trout Club's Instagram just to get a close-up view of these flies?
For
Absolutely.
Sure. Yeah. And if it's not the ones I tied here on a sewing needle, I have some replicas at home. So we'll get some good pictures up for sure.
The Trout Club site might take a day or two. The admins, off fishing somewhere, but we'll get them out there for sure in the very quick future. And then as well, we did record this. We are gonna put this on our YouTube channel. So if you want to rewatch any of the stuff, it'll be available out there as well in a couple of days.
And if anybody has like any nitty gritty questions about materials or whatever, you can message me. It's J Lampros, JLAMPROS 2 on Instagram. And I can post some pictures there too, like I said, of the flies. So thanks for coming out, guys. We hope to see you at the Steelheaders Ball and on the river here real soon. So
Thanks,
everyone.
Jim.
Have a good day.
thanks for coming.
Thank you very
You
much.
bet.